Hello, everybody, and this is a podcast show I like to call Two Jews and Three Opinions. I'm Winston, and I'm here with Raffi, and we decided to just wake up one day and put a show together. How's it going, Raffi?
Going pretty good. This is how I celebrate Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
I have political discussions.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Uh,
hopefully by the time people listen to this, it's going to be past Thanksgiving. But
That's
yeah,
true. Yeah,
first,
yeah, for sure.
first time for everything, I guess. Yeah, so how's Seattle going, man?
It's pretty awesome. I actually just found this like amazing speakeasy bar, which was like completely on accident. I just like wanted to go check out a bar, and it was like this super cool, swanky place. That was like you just pick up a phone next to this iron door inside the bar, and then they have this like semi-secret upstairs place where like there's no prices on the menu, and they just sort of like customize your drinks.
Wow. Do they also like cut the ice in front of you too, or something?
I'm sure if I was paying attention, that probably was happening.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's going well here. Like we talked a little earlier, it's really freaking cold here in Korea, and it
yep.
was -4 Celsius this morning, which is like in the mid 20s, almost 30 degrees.
Yep.
Um,
Not jealous at all.
yeah, yeah, about that. By the time my Korean friends tell me that by the time like December, January hits comes around, everybody's going to be wearing parkas and everything like that. So
Wow.
yeah,
I mean it makes sense, but I'd never like really pictured Korea getting quite that cold.
yeah. North Asia is like really cold, man.
It's yeah. No. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, before we get into things, why don't we introduce like what our backgrounds are? That way we know everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
All two of the people who listen to this will know like what kind of backgrounds we're coming from. So you can go ahead first, Rafi.
Okay, sure. I'm not sure quite how detailed to go into it. I guess going forward, if people have follow-up questions, happy to answer. But I was raised in a pretty liberal household. Have been pretty liberal, but not particularly involved until probably 2008. Then I got a little bit involved, uh, just in terms of paying attention to our government, and more so on the local level. So I started paying more attention to like my rep Tulsi Gabbard and Senator Schatz, who also like comes by our temple occasionally. And then with this past election in the primary, the Hawaii one was sort of just like kind of a disaster. So I got really involved. I'm a precinct president, which really just means I help to organize how the party tries to function
Yeah.
on the very basic level, which is like, can we actually set up a primary? Hopefully next time around we can. So yeah, I got pretty involved with that, and then just from a variety of different things that I've been seeing happening, I've just been getting really involved. For people who don't know me, I've sometimes organized political rallies. So that's sort of my background. I would say like I'm not organizing like 1,000 people political rallies. I'm organizing like 10 people going out and just kind of demonstrating their beliefs. And that's
Yeah.
also like that's definitely also I would say like one of my strongest beliefs in terms of just in political engagement, whatever you want to call it, like your vote counts for something, but getting engaged with your local government, in my opinion, counts for a lot more.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
as the saying
anyways,
goes, all politics are local. So you basically
yeah,
you're,
for
you're
sure.
coming from a background where you're basically organizing events for people to become more involved in the system.
Yeah, I heard a lot of people like, I mean, I'll just be straightforward. Like after the election, a lot of people wanted to get way more involved to protect things that they believed in, and I was like, okay, well, the avenues are there. I'm just going to show you how to get there.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I can show you where to dig, but the digging you must do yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll dig a
absolutely.
little bit too, but I need like I'm not going to be the only person out there
Right,
digging.
right. We can talk
um,
about political movements later, but yeah, it's
yeah, for
that's
sure.
all right. So, and you are born and raised in Hawaii, right? Just for everybody's.
Raised in Hawaii. I
Okay.
was born in New Jersey. We moved to Hawaii when I was 8, so I have a little bit of East Coast sarcasm, which I'm sure will come out.
Oh yeah,
But
of
yeah,
course.
But yeah,
Jersey, huh?
raised in Hawaii. Yeah, I'm wasn't at the time, but definitely pretty happy I ended up in Hawaii.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
I don't think anybody wouldn't be.
um,
Anyway,
well, I'm,
yeah.
yeah. While you give your intro, I'm just gonna plug in real quick.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, so everybody who doesn't know me, unlike Raffi, I came from a pretty conservative household. I was born and raised in Hawaii myself. My dad was U.S. military. My mom, not U.S. military. Obviously, they met and got married, and they settled in Hawaii. My dad's last assignment, and that's kind of where I was raised around a middle class background, but then my parents came up from the working class. They essentially, by the time I was born, they had just made it to the middle class, and like I said, a little bit more politically conservative household. My parents still to this day are some of the most socially conservative people I know. I myself personally identify as left of center. There are principles that there are independent principles that believe in on the left, and everything else, all the other issues, I just sort of take on a case by case basis. But the most important value to me is individuality, individual rights, and freedom of speech. And go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to follow up on that. I realized, like I said, I was raised in a liberal background, but I have a lot of liberal beliefs, but I don't really believe in parties. To just put it on a base level, I think that sometimes they create an overarching view which is not really representative, and sometimes I really dislike that label.
A narrative.
But
they create a narrative
yeah, for
that
sure.
people need to be invested in. That can cause
Yeah.
problems sometimes, as we're discussed later
Yep.
today. So the first kind of topic we wanted to talk about, sort of not really a post-election topic right now, but something that's been in the news lately that I don't think a lot of people quite understand unless you're actually there on the ground. And that'll be the what is it, the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
And
So I can give a little more.
yeah, go
background
ahead.
on that.
Raffi,
Yeah.
you've actually gotten a little more engaged in this topic than I have. So
Yeah. So just from like a purely factual background, the Dakota Access Pipeline is run by Energy Transfer Partners, and they run a variety of different pipelines. And I believe they also hold some other energy consolidation projects throughout the country. So I'm not sure when they started this project, but essentially the problematic part, like most of the pipeline is already built. It goes from Canada down to I want to say Louisiana or in that area. But do
you want me to just go ahead and give like a rundown of like just baseline what the pipeline is, or I have a sort of a fact sheet pulled up.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of like what the purpose is.
Yeah, sure. So
go for it.
The DAPP, the Dakota Access Pipeline Project, this is according to their website, is about 1,172 mile, 30-inch diameter pipeline that's going to enable domestically produced crude oil from North Dakota to reach major refining markets. It'll transport about 470,000 barrels per day of oil, and it's supposed to connect the Bakken and Three Forks production area in North Dakota with existing pipelines in Illinois. And let's see here, a couple of things it claims is that it protects landowner interests in the local environment is top priority, and it'll employ new advanced pipeline technology to ensure safety and reliability. But the national benefits is they claim that they're trying to be the pipeline is trying to help the country become truly independent of foreign imports. And the local economy, it's supposed to create about 8,000 to 12,000 local jobs during the construction, and bring in a lot of state revenue. So, but however, the controversy regarding this pipeline is something you can enumerate more on. I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I read part of that website, but it is just good to hear a refresher on that. Because I do think independence from foreign oil, one way or another, is certainly it plays into a huge foreign policy discussion.
Sure, but I
Which there's,
mean, the other thing, the other side of that is who we're getting the oil from, and it's true we
yeah,
still import a lot of foreign oil, but you know what foreign country we import most of our oil from?
I don't actually.
It's Canada. So I
Yeah,
mean,
I
they're
was
such a huge
suspecting that,
threat.
but
Yeah, the Canadians are such a huge threat. Obviously, we need to find a way to get
yes,
independent of them.
yeah, yeah. I don't know if you saw that Canadian. What was it like? There's some Canadian campaign about like "We still love you, America."
Yeah, yeah,
So big threats from Canada.
yeah.
Anyways, so yeah, the at least in terms of, I'm gonna speak to the threats in terms of
Sure.
the way I've heard them from the people on the ground. So just as some background, I have two pretty close friends that are currently in Standing Rock right now. So just to explain where the tension is a little bit more. So right now the pipeline is going under a reservoir. I forget the name of, not really a reservoir, more of a lake, and also I believe that feeds into Cannonball River, which then goes into, I believe, the Missouri. So
Right, the Missouri River.
and yeah, and so part of the territory definitely, like, it's like the tip of what at one point was an agreed upon treaty, which denoted some of that land to Native Americans. I believe specifically the Sioux tribe.
Right, and
So that
you're talking about the 1851. Whoa,
Yep.
shoot, yeah, it's this treaty in 1851. I'm trying to find the name of, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and in full clarity, I've not researched the legality of either like that treaty or how the United States interprets that treaty.
Okay, I found it. It says here the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, which was signed by 8 tribes and the U.S. government. And over the last century, tribes have challenged this treaty and others like it in court for not being honored, and claiming that the U.S. government is not honoring the agreement and taking their land. And we have never ceded, quote, we have never ceded this land. If Dakota Access Pipeline can go through and claim eminent domain on landowners and native peoples on their own land, then we as sovereign nations can declare eminent domain on our own Aboriginal homeland. And that's a quote from Joy Braun of the Indigenous Environmental Network. So there's a legal precedence and a legal argument to be made here as well.
Yeah. So that's I would say that's probably, in terms of legal argument, that's probably the strongest argument from a land ownership perspective. So there's acknowledgement of essentially legal agreements that were made, or lack of acknowledgement. And I know that Energy Transfer Partners has spoken to this about essentially their perspective is their public perspective is, yeah, I mean, if the United States government isn't honoring these treaties, and that's something that needs to be addressed, but we purchased this land under what we thought was U.S. law, according, not necessarily purchased, but essentially they apply for easement, because some of that land is also owned by the Army Corps of Engineers, and so it's this overlap of Army Corps of Engineer land. So I want to be careful about the language I use because some people would take offense to this, but supposed Native American land, and then like, and land that Energy Transfer Partners has essentially said, like, wait, we have legal ownership over this. Like, what's the problem? But so within that area, there are also the Sioux tribe, the Standing Rock tribe, I should say. I believe back in September, identified burial grounds that at the time were along the route of the pipeline, and one of the things that really sort of started to spark this onto a bigger level was the day after the Standing Rock tribe identified those burial grounds. Before they had identified it for one of the court orders to contest land ownership, and also to acknowledge, also for the Army Corps of Engineers to acknowledge these are culturally relevant lands for the Native Americans. And the way the legal process works is, like, you have to submit a document that shows that these are actually, like, you can't just say that they're culturally significant lands. You have to, like, demonstrate how they're culturally significant. So they provided a document for that. And while essentially, like, once it was made public in court, Energy Transfer Partners went to that section of land and essentially did the base layer of construction to clear the ground for the pipeline. And that's really where I think that's where things started escalating, not necessarily in terms of violence, but just in terms of direct confrontation. Like previously, like people were demonstrating on the land that the construction was going to happen, but it wasn't until that happened where I think there was quite as much face-to-face, like, I see you, construction worker, doing work, or like a construction worker in their defense trying to do their job, and I imagine to some extent potentially feeling unsafe doing the construction. So that's one of the areas. And I'll just like real quick list sort of the bullet point things of like what the tribes at least are defending, which are environmental rights / what they claim to be injustice, and sort of the background thought behind that is oil pipeline spill. Like if you go research oil pipelines, regardless, like yes, I agree that it probably is the newest and greatest technology, but no oil pipeline is ever going to say that it won't spill, because they spill. Like you're transporting an insane amount of oil from one place to another, and at some point, like it's like a pipe in your house, like at some point your pipe's just not going to work properly.
I'm sending you an article right now about
sure.
It is from the Oil and Gas Journal, which is a scholarly source, and it talks about pipeline inspections and the conclusions about reliability based method assessments of corroding oil pipelines. And basically what the research here says is that the failure probability of a pipeline from a 15-year span from its inspection date, the probability of total pipeline failure, according to one of their charts here, goes up to 100% within the 9 to 10 year mark.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and
corrosion
defects. There are a number of corrosion defects within the elapsed time that can be observed, and then the report later goes on into addressing the benefits of having constant inspections and constant repairs, and the optimum number of years that you can go after making those repairs before it becomes unsafe again. But of course, this is what I believe to be engineering reports written by engineers. I could be wrong, but this is hard science based on a number of factors that these scientists have said. Yeah, this pipeline, or pipelines, oil pipelines in general, have shelf lives, and the reason why I bring up who wrote these reports is because, in theory, if you continuously reinspect these pipelines and then repair them per scheduled maintenance, sure, the pipelines can be safe. However, being in the military myself and understanding how government projects work, that's highly dependent on whether or not you will have the manning to do these projects. And that's not always the case. As we saw with the BP oil spill, there were a handful of government inspectors on these oil rigs for hundreds and hundreds of these oil rigs. So clearly the manning is not going to be there for federal oversight. Whether or not the company itself will provide manning to provide constant overwatch and repairs and maintenance on these oil pipelines, it's going to be a big issue in the future.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there are a variety of factors that will affect that, but I mean, if oil pipelines continue to be constructed, I think at the very least that we'll probably see that happen.
Absolutely. And this article that I linked, Raffi, it's going to be in the source listing of our video. Is dated January 13th, 2003. So a little bit old, but still reliable research, because oil pipelines have been being used for a long time now in our current stage of technology. And as far as I'm aware, the technology for a pipe remains largely the same as far as I'm aware. I mean, I was just looking at the bottom. It definitely looks like a
pretty. I mean, I haven't looked at these sources, but it's pretty heavily sourced. But yeah, I think that I agree with you that like this article, which is coming from as far as I understand, is coming from the industry, is saying, yeah, with anything, like if you don't take care of it, it's going to have problems.
Yeah.
And we do see that. Probably, I would say actually we don't see that as much as it actually happens. I want to say it was like I think it's the Patriot pipeline. I might have that totally off.
Where is
south,
this pipeline?
in the southeast.
Okay.
I should probably pull it up. If I find some information on it.
Patriot Pipeline you mean the company, Patriot Pipeline Inc.?
Yeah, I believe so. There was a major pipeline disruption that happened earlier in 2016, and it actually like caused, like, if you look away from the environmental side, if you look at the economic side, it just like caused this huge problem for the Southeast because like you couldn't. It's the main oil pipeline, and you couldn't get oil, so there were literally trucks. There were just a ton of trucks that were trucking in oil from other parts of the company, which costs a lot more. So it affects anyone who relies on the oil economy, which is largely everyone.
Yeah. You said this was earlier in 2016.
Yeah, I believe so.
Like August.
I think there was I'll pull it up right now.
All right. So the main issues for the protesters and the reason why they're protesting are crude oil spills into their water source, correct? And
which to clarify, it's not just the river, it's their main source of drinking water. Like if they want to drink water, that's where they get it from.
Okay. And as well as the land sovereignty issue. Not
land
sovereignty, but land ownership, if you will.
Legality.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I know that especially within the progressive movement, I can't speak so much for Standing Rock, but from what I've heard also from Standing Rock, is that also like the thought process is it is an oil pipeline and climate change is a real and growing problem. And essentially just for the future generations, not only don't we support it on a local level, but we don't want this pipeline to even be built in terms of the national level. And granted that's much more complicated. Like we can't just provide anti-solutions, I guess, but like we have to come up with solutions if we're going to say we can't use oil.
I have heard that argument a lot from the progressive side. Is if we're not just the progressive side, but some classic liberal sources have said, why are we trying to continue our dependence on fossil fuels if we're trying to go and explore new sources of energy? However, what about this claim that the pipeline is going to be providing a number of economic impacts and benefits for the country? Do you think that the risks to this community are outweighed by the benefits by this pipeline, or vice versa?
Well, I think also just like, I mean, my opinion is no, that there's more risk than benefits, but also just to point out some more moral ambiguity. This pipeline was originally scheduled to go through Bismarck, North Dakota. And Bismarck, North Dakota, which is a better, I wouldn't necessarily say well off. I've not researched how like the average per capita income of Bismarck, but they're a more economically stable community, and they're also a much more Caucasian community, which said, no, we don't want this pipeline coming through our town, because if it spills, then like our drinking water, like what are you going to do about our drinking water? And the company said, okay, well, we'll go put it somewhere else. And so I think that's one of the other things we have to look at is like, why when one community says this isn't okay, it it moves, but then when another community says basically the exact same thing, it just gets bulldozed right over. And then on top of that,
well, I mean, on top of that,
So
Bismarck is the capital of North Dakota. It's the state capital of North Dakota.
Yeah.
So, of course, there's going to be more people there. So, of course, they have if they
Certainly.
make enough of a stink, they can be like, no, we're not going to put this pop into our capital.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It just reeks of it reeks of something shady, because it's like, okay, we don't want to put this through this town because these people said, but it's okay to put it through Lakota Indian burial grounds. Like, really?
Yeah, and I will point out, so one of the things that's really not getting as much news is there are like plenty of farmers who are like not associated with like Lakota or the Sioux. Yeah, like they're completely unassociated, who have also been fighting this tooth and nail.
Yeah.
And have like, like on top of water, I also don't want oil spilling onto our farms.
Yeah, our farmlands, absolutely.
Yeah. So and I mean, like, it gets into this challenge of like the federal government and in terms of like how much power do they have for the greater sake of the larger public for these public projects, because the idea is if it's for the greater good, then like, I mean, realistically, like at some point we needed oil. I mean, even now we need oil. At some point we needed energy, and not every, like, if we tried to ask every single person along this route for this space, like the pipeline would just flat out never get built, which like, and at this point in time I support, but like there are going to be other public projects which we will need.
Yeah.
And it's going to have to go through people's lands, and that's one of the more ambiguous, challenging things, is at least for U.S. citizens, because the reality is that Native tribes, if we're really respecting them, are not U.S. citizens. They're tribes of their own nations. But for U.S. citizens, like how do we address that? So I don't know. That's also you
pointed out something really, really interesting too, because that's something a lot of people don't necessarily know too, is that Native tribes can choose the status of not being U.S. citizens and being tribes of their own, right? So there's that legal issue to go through as well, and
which is also a whole nother funky ball game, just because even tribes who choose not to be U.S. citizens, like where they choose not to be U.S. citizens, I believe still do get aid from the U.S. government. Yeah. Which, granted, like there are also plenty of other countries that are completely independent from the United States which receive U.S. aid.
Like Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico.
Wow, okay, that sounds really ignorant. Not Puerto Rico is a territory. I was thinking of Costa Rica. Excuse me.
Yeah.
I wasn't. Yeah, I jumbled it too in my head. Costa Rica. Yeah, Costa Rica is its own independent nation, receives a lot of U.S. aid. In fact, it's the only country in the world without an army. So. Interesting.
And I mean, like, there are a lot of European countries that, especially even now, are saying like they have a vastly reduced army because of U.S. engagement with their country.
Yeah. But that's a whole topic we can talk about.
Sorry.
No worries.
Away from the Dakota Access.
No, this is a free speech zone, Raffi. You don't need to worry about offending anybody or going off tangent too much.
All of the tangents.
Yeah. It's really interesting though to see the whole Native tribes status within the U.S. government. Because when I was driving from Texas up to Missouri for my first duty assignment, I passed by a number of cars which had Cherokee license plates, like Cherokee Nation license plates. Like, well, all right, yeah, these guys have their own license plate and probably their own form of government ID within their own tribal government networks and association with the tribe. That's actually,
I've never experienced that, so that's interesting. I mean, yeah, it's interesting also how like a license plate will really speak. Like, I know these tribes have separate governments, but a license plate somehow in my brain like speaks that much more to their separation.
I passed by a number of cars, especially there are a couple of law enforcement cars, like Cherokee Nation law enforcement cars that had Cherokee Nation license plates on them. So this is for the people on the ground, this stuff is pretty real, and the
For sure.
environmental impact basically needs to be reassessed, because the ETP, their argument is that they bought the land. It's private land, which is why they're having police and why they're having police and the sheriff's department, armed services, not armed services, but armed response to the protesters, because they consider that this is private land, and
I mean, it's considered trespassing under, I would say, under the way the North Dakota government has interpreted it.
And again, that goes back to the legal issue of the land itself, based on the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. So that there's a couple of issues that have to be sorted out before anything can move forward on this issue, I'm sure. Now,
well, and it's interesting too, because like even like there's difference in opinions between federal agencies, the federal like government, and talking about like the White House and state governments, because the Justice Department and the Army Corps of Engineers basically, and like part of this is the Army Corps of Engineer land, like ETP, Energy Transfer Partners, literally they have to request easement in order to finish the project, and they have requested easement on Army Corps lands. But the Justice Department and the Army Corps have all said, you do not currently have permission to be doing construction on this land. Mm-hmm. And there's this thing in the United States where corporations are not encouraged to, not that they're encouraged to like break the law, but they're not necessarily encouraged to follow the law because they just pay a fine. And so you have this like really bizarre situation where the North Dakota government is saying, like, not that they're necessarily saying, but they're acting as if Energy Transfer Partners owns the land and they're protecting them, while at the same time Army Corps is saying you don't own this land and you don't have permission to dig on it yet. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, Energy Transfer Partners is doing exactly on Army Corps of Engineer land exactly what the Army Corps of Engineers has said not to do. Yeah. Which essentially they have an area. First of all, they've done any construction on this land, which the Army Corps said don't do that, because it's within 20 miles of a certain area, this contested area.
So that's another interesting thing. The reason why the Army Corps of Engineers is even involved in this whole situation. Yeah. Federal forces usually don't get involved in state or local matters by constitutional, by our constitution.
Yeah.
So and this is because the Army Corps of Engineers has some of this land. Is that what you said earlier?
Yeah. So it's basically part of it. I don't even think it's that big of a portion of land. Is owned by the Army Corps. Mm-hmm. And they basically, in order to use that land, you just have to request an easement. And Energy Transfer Partners had already requested the easement and was expecting it to just go through. Mm-hmm. And I think about 2 weeks ago, the Army Corps said, no, you never really addressed. So according to Army Corps policy, there should be at least engagement with the local tribes before construction is done. And sometimes like that's not really paid attention to, and I'm not really sure where that process does or does not fall through the cracks. But in this situation, the Army Corps said, no, you never actually had that engagement in a way that we're satisfied by. Mm-hmm. And so now you have this like really bizarre, funky situation where the Army Corps is saying, in order to use our land, to Energy Transfer Partners, in order to use our land, you need to go back and talk to the people who are like protesting on our land and come at least acknowledge further before you can go ahead and get the easement.
Yeah, and that. So what you're basically saying, I'm sorry, I'm trying to clarify here. What you're basically saying is that the Army Corps of Engineers role in this whole situation is just facilitation and facilitation of construction, provided that the company involved meets the legal standards that will approve their involvement.
Correct.
Is that Is that okay?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty close.
And it's really fun. So I actually have the full statement that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers posted in the 14th of this month, earlier this month. Let's see here. It says, the Army has determined that additional discussion and analysis are warranted in light of the history of the Great Sioux Nation's dispossession of lands, the importance of Lake Oahe, O-A-H-E. I'm not a Lakota language expert, so
I think that's close. I don't know.
To the tribe, yeah. Apologies for mangling your language if there are any Lakota listeners to this ever. Our government-to-government relationship and the statute governing easements through government property. The Army invites the Standing Rock Sioux tribe to engage a discussion regarding potential conditions on an easement for the pipeline crossing that would reduce the risk of a spill or rupture, hasten detection in response to the possible spill, or any possible spill, or otherwise enhance protection of the lake and the tribe's water supplies. And I'm going to snip this a little bit because it's going to get a little long, and then the Army continues to welcome any input that the tribe believes is relevant to the proposed pipeline crossing and the granting of an easement. While these discussions are ongoing, construction on or under Corps land bordering the lake cannot occur because the Army has not made a final decision on whether to grant an easement. The Army will work with the tribe on a timeline that allows for robust discussion and analysis to be completed expeditiously. We fully support the rights of all Americans to assemble and speak freely, and urge everyone involved to protest or pipeline activities to adhere to the principles of nonviolence. So, what I'm getting from this is it turns out when you send the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to go to fight in Afghanistan for 15 years, doing counterinsurgency, one of the big lessons they learned is you need to engage with the indigenous population. Who knew?
Yeah.
Surprise. If the government and ETP thought that the Army Corps was just going to side with them, they were dead wrong. Maybe you shouldn't have sent them to go fight in Afghanistan for 15 years.
Then this situation might be a little easier for ETP, but it's true. I mean, and that could speak to. I mean, and I think a lot of the issues. This is a tiny tangent. Like a lot of the issues we're going to talk about are like not just being heard, because you can't just listen to someone and say, okay, we heard you, and like we're still going to do our thing. But a lot of these things are just like. We're not acknowledging each other. On both sides. And I have a certain perspective, so I think it leans a certain way, but the only way if we're going to productively move past that, it's going to be by discussing opinions that we disagree with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that the Army is taking the stance of, again, being the nonpartisan third party, as the military is supposed to, by our Constitution. And unfortunately, the news media doesn't make it easy when they portray, like, I'm serious, like the news media, when they put articles out about the Dakota Access Pipeline issue and they're talking about the brutality that the protesters are experiencing, what they say is like, well, the police and armed forces, implying that it's the police and the military that are doing this.
Which is not the case at all.
It's not true, because like I said earlier, constitutionally, the United States Army is not allowed to engage in that manner with U.S. citizens. It is illegal.
Yeah.
And and you can say, oh, well, it's illegal, but the government can break its own laws. Shenanigans. There's massive amount of oversight that goes along with Title 10 and Title 15.
And I'll speak to this from like the protester side. Like the only reason I've seen an Army Corps number is to request them to do specifically what they did. And I mean, people would have liked them to have gone further and just rejected the easement entirely. But I've never seen protesters posting an Army Corps number requesting them to withdraw any officials, because they don't have anyone there. If you actually go and research all the law enforcement that are there are like 20 different local law enforcement agencies throughout North Dakota, and I think I don't know if it's still 5, but at one point there were like 5 from 5 different states.
What?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of these states have actually started withdrawing some of their police forces for a variety of different reasons. Some of them were just like we weren't really needed for whatever reason, which I don't know if that's really true.
Yeah,
But
no kidding, man. You talking about jurisdiction issues and everything.
yeah, well, I haven't researched this. I only saw it yesterday. I guess there are like for extreme emergencies, you can request other states to send emergency personnel.
Okay.
Um,
But
and I guess
that usually precipitates a lot of turf wars and well, you have to ask us for help. Okay, yeah, we'll give you your help as long as you bow down to us and spit our shoes and spit shine our shoes and all that. Like it's usually like a pride issue when it comes to the uniform services.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that I don't know, they would bring so much police presence to this area.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even know how much it's cost other state police departments, but I know that the North Dakota government has used between $10 and $15 million so far just in their police forces for dealing with Standing Rock.
Yeah.
That's not even dealing with medical issues. That's not even dealing with legal time that's been spent on this, which also like I can go a whole nother route. I have Caucasian friends who have been treated a certain way in court for one crime, and they know other people who are not Caucasian who have been treated an entirely different way in court for the same exact crime. So this issue goes like pretty deep into like a lot of different just challenges in terms of like how we think how like we would like to think our government is run versus the reality that there are people running our government, and if we're not involved in our government then it's going to be run a certain way.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good segue to the next topic we're going to talk about is this so post-election the foreign policy of the United States, basically how that's going to look like with the Trump presidency.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about sovereignty issues between the Native American tribes and the United States, but I mean, like, what about the United States and our partners overseas? It looks like so far that a lot of the current leaders in the world are trying to speak to President-elect Trump pretty early on. Before he's even sworn in.
Ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and our own news media too doesn't really do them any favors as well, because they're of all they're blaming Trump. They're saying like, oh well, he hasn't called a press conference in forever, and we don't know why he's not trying to be transparent about his administration changeovers. As much as I disliked the outcome of a Trump presidency, you can't exactly blame the guy for not calling a press conference with a news media that vilified him, portrayed him as this giant raging bigot, racist, sexist, homophobe for the last 9 months, and expect him to be like, okay, yeah, guys, I wanna talk to you about getting my message out to the public. I mean, like, it does not matter what you think of the man. You have to look at him. No,
I mean, it would be like,
right. A natural human bias. It's like, okay, well, these guys have been saying bad things about me, so I'm not going to use these guys to send my message out, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, it's like why I think Obama might have been on Fox News once or twice during his president, but like for the large part, like if Obama decides to go anywhere, it's usually not on a Fox News station because he just feels, I mean, and I personally would agree with him, but it's like he feels that Fox News would not necessarily treat him fairly. And it's the same for this particular situation. It's the same argument. It's like news media are independent, private organizations for the most part. There are a few public ones, but largely the ones we pay attention to are private organizations, which do have the right to have specific views, even though I don't necessarily like that. And
by saying you don't necessarily like that, you mean you don't necessarily like their views.
Yeah, I mean,
you disagree with their views, but you're okay with them saying what they want to say because it's a free country.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Winston and I talked about this a little bit about this last night about freedom of speech, and just I will, like, from my point of view, I will defend a neo-Nazi or a Nazi's right to say whatever they want in this country because it's free speech. I will also like not I don't want to say fight, but I will do everything in my power to prevent them from doing those things. But yeah, so speaking to the free speech part, like I disagree with Fox News most of the time.
I
But
think the majority of Americans that are younger than 50 years old would disagree with Fox News.
yeah, I think yeah.
Their demographic
Yeah, I mean if
is
you
getting
look at
pretty
the
old.
if you look at yeah.
Have you seen the
Yeah.
articles about their demographic? They're
Yeah.
getting older and older.
But to not necessarily in their defense, but like to look at the demographics in general, like I don't think many people our age are really paying that much attention to cable news in general. I mean,
Yeah, because right now the news media is so narrative driven these days.
Yeah, it's definitely narrative driven, and
as opposed to journalism, the fourth estate used to be about challenging power and using facts to challenge that power.
Yeah.
As opposed to having a media narrative that you want to push forward. And unfortunately, I have to say that kind of stuff started happening around the Bush era, actually, like after the Iraq War. After the Iraq War and further on, especially with the election of President Obama, the media seemed to have this particular left-wing narrative they wanted to push out to everybody, and everybody who had dissenting points of view or disagreed with them either were shunted away and got hired by Fox News, or their views weren't properly represented. It wasn't given a fair hearing by cable news and investigative journalism. So
yeah, and I think the key word there is investigative journalism, because I mean, my opinion is I don't necessarily think that the news has gotten more left wing. I think it's just gotten less investigative. Like I think if you actually went to the facts, that we might still be talking about a lot of similar situations. But the reality, like I personally, like, I haven't watched cable news in a couple of years until like the past couple of weeks before the election, and CBS, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, they're all like, I've 2 weeks straight and I didn't see a single investigative news piece. And it was just all people with opinions. And like, yeah, there are talk shows and there are places for that. But like, the point of news is to get like factual information. And if your quote unquote factual information is coming from people's opinions, then like, there's no basis.
Yeah, there's no baseline. There's no baseline facts that you can rely on and make your own decisions based off of.
I mean, if it's all opinions, then anyone can say the news is right or wrong, and they're just continuing the opinion.
Yeah, which is why I'm thankful for independent news media. It's starting to make a surge push before the election and after the election, because they were this year more than any other year. It was clear that mainstream news media had a particular narrative they wanted to push on everyone.
Yep.
And a lot of people got sick of that and turned to independent media, and they basically delivered, drove away their audience to these independent news media outlets.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, so to circle back around, essentially you have these opinionated news media, and to find it surprising that Trump doesn't want to meet with President-elect Trump doesn't want to meet with them is, I just like, if you find that surprising, then like, as much as you may not like our president-elect, like, you have to acknowledge the reality that there's a reason why he might not want to talk to the news media.
Yeah.
Like, it's
given
given
their track record.
So
yeah. And the other thing is that all of these foreign leaders are more willing to speak to Trump, and that's an interesting angle on its own, because the news media is not reporting this, but there are either two reasons why world leaders, despite the fact that worlds over countries have said, oh, Trump is not going to be allowed to visit this country if he becomes president, and all the people denouncing him. Big ticket world leaders, Theresa May from England, from the UK. Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister Shinzo
Yep.
Abe. I think even Bibi Netanyahu has met him. I could be wrong with that though. These big name leaders are visiting him because they either A, believe he's a more malleable candidate to work with when it comes to international negotiations between the U.S. and their country, or B, it points to the fact that they haven't been able to make very many negotiating inroads with the Obama administration.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there might also be a third point. I haven't, we sort of discussed earlier, I'm a little less familiar with this topic, but I do also wonder if there's a third point of just like Trump. I don't want to make this too opinionated, but oh god, Trump, like, how do I interact with this person? Like, let me talk to him as soon as possible so I can like at least try and get off on the right
So yeah,
foot,
to
no matter
figure out what he's about. Okay,
yeah.
that's a good point. That's a really good point. It could be that as well.
Yeah, and not to invalidate the previous 2 points, because I think those are definitely, I do think those are definitely valid. I mean, the way regardless of whether it's Bush or Obama or Trump, like the U.S. government, federal government, treats itself as like, you will work with us kind of situation, and so just based on that stance, like some people are going to get shut out, and so I'm sure there's.
What do you mean by the notion of you will work with us kind of thing? What do you mean by that?
Just like the leader of the free world, we make the decisions kind of situation, and if you don't like them, then we're going to sanction you, but it's going to be harder for you on some level if you're not willing to cooperate with us. I'm speaking in terms of like the government leaders who might have, like, Bibi Netanyahu, for instance, like that's maybe not a good example because there's actually good relationship minus the whole engaging the Republican Party, but sort of went off on a side tangent there and lost my train of thought.
Oh no, I mean, I think you're trying to say that when it comes to U.S. interests, we have the U.S. government always tries to push for, they try to push for. I know how to put this, because in international politics, the first rule is number one. You have no friends. You only have interests.
Yeah.
And
yep.
Pushing our interests and getting our interests out of nations that are not as powerful enough to resist us is, I think, what you're trying to get at.
Yeah, that was much more eloquently stated.
Usually, so there's a little bit of that I disagree with, but there's some of that I do agree with, because nations like, for example, the one I'm in Korea, we work incredibly closely with our Korean allies because there's a common threat that is north of their country. And the Korean government has allowed us to stay here for as long as the Korean War has had an armistice in 1953. They allow us to be based here. We have several army camps here. We have 2 Air Force bases here. I'm not sure about who paid for the construction, who pays for the maintenance of the land. I know in Japan, all the bases that we have are paid for by the Japanese government, and the U.S. maintains them because the Japanese, they realize they need the American forces there as deterrent against the number of nations that may work against Japan's interests. And so the deal with Japan, U.S. Forces Japan, is that I believe the Japanese government pays for those bases while we inhabit them and pay for the maintenance costs. Korea, I believe it may be similar. I could be wrong, but what I do know from being here is that we work very, very closely with the Koreans. We share we share certain things with the Koreans that we don't share with other nations we may be allied to, even some of our European allies.
I mean, on a certain level, that makes sense, because there's just a lot more need to work so closely between the militaries. In that region.
Now, that being said, and also one more situation: the South China Sea. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but the South China Sea dispute has driven a lot of those countries bordering China into our hands, into our arms, because they fear the rise of China as being an overarching, dictatorial, not dictatorial, but like they're afraid of a position where the Chinese government can dictate to them the terms of how they use the South China Sea.
Yeah.
And so it's driven them into our arms. The Vietnamese the Vietnamese and the United States are working more closely together than we've ever had in our political history. The Philippines, up until the recent president was elected, it was pretty darn good. And
that was an interesting development.
Yeah, we can talk about that later. That's a whole another debacle. Anyway, the guy. My personal opinion, the guy's a lunatic. But the Vietnamese.
Agreed.
Yeah, the Vietnamese. I mean, he is. The Filipino military, I know, likes us. And a number of other nations out there that have dispute claims with China are asking for our support in the political international relations realm because of that. Now, that being said, there are a number of issues that we face on the diplomatic level with great powers, such as Russia, that we kind of have been lacking on with all the way back before like Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. The Russians and the Obama administration didn't really get along all that well, because when the Ukrainian government fell to an organized group that used the grassroots protests to take power and change the government, that signaled a number of things to Russia. Number one, Russia's peripheral interests is that directly to their west, they have two nations that are essentially buffer states between NATO and them. They don't care so much about the three Baltic states, not Baltic, the three, what are they called? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I don't know what that, I think it's Baltic states. The Balkans are the former, Serbia and all that, right? Okay, so the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're not much of a threat to Russia on their border. Unless NATO makes a concerted effort to place troops there, which they haven't yet.
It's a lot
recently.
It's a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
Just geographically, it's harder to get troops there from where troops are currently stationed. It's harder to get troops to those states versus to Ukraine. I mean, we're at this point we're supplying mass amounts of arms to Ukraine.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's really hard to justify a nation not to defend itself. But at the same time, if you're looking at it from the Russian perspective, they have a buffer state. One of their buffer states now is no longer a guaranteed Russian-friendly state. So what do you do?
Yeah.
And on top of that, the West is using this situation to expand the reach of their alliance, and then they're starting to see a multinational exercise happening on their border.
It's true.
It is kind of concerning, obviously, for that to happen to the Russians. And on top of that, since the Soviet Union has fell, there's been a distinct lack of respect, really, for Russia as a power in the region because of the fall of the Soviet Union. And don't get me wrong, the fall of the Soviet Union was one of the better triumphs of the 20th century. Probably the best triumph of the 20th century. However, what you do with the remains will determine how that nation in the future will interact with you, and it's become very adversarial. And it's not only because of Putin. Putin is merely a reaction to the symptoms and the big problems that have arisen from our relations with Russia post-Soviet Union. The whole Boris Yeltsin presidency kind of just showed to the world, and how the media portrayed him showed to the world, that Russia was the sick man of Europe. And that can do a lot of things to a nation's psyche, to how people interact with the nation, whether it comes to trade or international relations, because of that. And so there has been a distinct lack of respect from the West toward Russia and Russian interests. Even if we oppose it, it's okay to voice concerns and to oppose Russian actions around the world, especially in Syria, and the kind of things that they're supporting the regime doing to its own citizens. But At the same time, there needs to be a respect for that other side's interests if you're going to come to even negotiations, and that's the main thing, I think, when it comes to Trump being contacted by various leaders around the world. Even Russia came out and made a statement. It's like, oh well, we want to normalize relations with the United States now because there's going to obviously be a new president. And I think that kind of spoke to, at the very least, spoke to the fact that Putin is more open to negotiating with a newer president because it was really hard to negotiate with the president currently in office.
Yeah.
Who chose a more adversarial route with Russia.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree with it, all that was said, and it definitely, I think it goes back to the role that the U.S. leadership views itself in, and like it's a very challenging thing to deal with because on one hand, like negotiating power is like supposed to be this thing that helps you achieve your goals, and on the other hand, using your negotiating power can limit you in achieving those goals, and so it's like this very funky thing, specifically like in terms of acknowledging the relationship with Russia. And then I think, in my opinion, one of the things that almost weakens the US's standing in terms of worldview is situations like Syria, where, and don't get me wrong, like Syria without any is extremely complicated, and then when you add in external involvement, it's just like, how many more layers of complicated can we throw at this thing?
Oh yeah, Syria is a situation I can enumerate on at great length because of personal experience. The Syrian situation, the way the current administration leapt into it was rather poor in this individual's opinion. in my individual opinion was rather poor because it seemed like there was very little research on what was happening on the ground and who was inhabiting what factions, and there was no concentrated effort on the ground that was organized enough to represent an entire coalition of anti-Assad people. And so we just sort of threw money and arms around at whatever group was dedicated to deposing the Assad regime without much regard to the consequences of funding and arming these groups. Some of them turned out to either dissolve, splinter, or mesh with jihadist groups. And you get into a weird situation where now we're funding the people that we fight the war on terror against, these Islamic jihadist groups. And
that's not what we didn't want to do that.
No, I mean, don't you wanna fund your Islamic radical group of the day to get just your interests fulfilled?
Or like let's fund our enemies. Sure, whatever. Cool. That sounds good.
It makes it more of a challenge. It's more fun to beat them all when you do that.
Yeah, it was going too easy, and so like
make it harder.
Yeah. No, yeah, I mean, sorry, that was the dry sarcasm coming out.
Yeah.
No, but that definitely, and it's like, I think that's one of the challenges as like our supposed, one of my friends likes to call us like the defender of the free world, which like as an ideal, I would love to strive for that, but we can't just go into other countries because someone like a group of people in that country wants us to come there. Like, you have to be strategic about thinking about this, and I'm not at all trying to underplay back then or now the plight of, at the very least, tens and hundreds of thousands of people, probably like millions of people. But the reality is that at the time, like, I'm not going to say Assad was like a great person or anything, but Assad's regime was in power. There's a government structure, and Yeah, I mean, like what you were
It was
saying is just
stable. You're
like,
saying that it was the situation
yeah, it's
before
a
was stable.
stable. Yeah, I mean, riots in the street and people getting shot. Like no one. I certainly don't think that's an acceptable situation, but it was a stable situation, and even for people that were not doing well under that regime, it in terms of quality of life, shitty of quality of life. I don't know. We can bleep this out. But
I don't care.
yeah, a shitty quality of life does not even begin to compare to a complete war zone. Um, and and that's not to discount the crimes against humanity that the Assad regime did commit. But
Yeah,
it's just like that. It's a complicated situation, and then that's in within the country, and then on top of that, it's like Russia is a core ally to the Assad regime, and and in all reality, once this started devolving, in the views I imagine of a lot of people in that area, like I mean, I guess it depends literally on geographically where you are, but Russia's almost viewed as like this peacekeeper, and it's like
I wouldn't
not that.
necessarily say that because
I mean, I wouldn't agree with that, but
to the areas that Russia so to the areas that support
yeah,
the Assad regime, which is basically the west coast of the country, they definitely see Russia as that
yeah,
key ally.
yeah,
Of course, that's because the news media there doesn't
yeah,
show them that the Assad regime and the Russians are indiscriminately killing
yeah.
civilians in the conflict zone. But I see your point. Russia,
Yeah, it's not,
our
yeah,
moves in Syria have essentially given the moral high ground to Russia in
yeah.
by perception wise. It's not true, but
Perception.
perception
Yeah,
wise, we have ceded somewhat of a moral high ground to the Russians because of our actions there. Absolutely,
yeah.
and
And I would agree that it's like that. I don't think that's at all the case, but how we handled it left that situation for Russia to pretend like it was a peacekeeper,
yeah,
which obviously,
pretend like it came in and solved
yeah,
everything or was going to
yeah,
solve everything, provide a better
yeah,
alternate solution to what the United States was doing, and I
theoretically,
agree with that. I think that our moves to support various rebel groups, various anti-Assad groups, and then the West, the entire Western, the first
yeah,
world's call to say, "Oh, Assad must go," and that
yeah,
drumbeat that the Obama administration was putting out severely undermined our position in that country when we're fighting ISIS.
yeah,
It gives the Russians and their allies a stick to beat the United States with when it comes to counter ISIS operations there, and the
yeah,
situation in general that's in Iraq and Syria. So yeah, it poorly mishandled.
yeah.
And again, going back to things that the media doesn't talk about,
Mm-hmm.
the the Obama administration. So I have mixed feelings. Like I said, I'm left of center, but I have mixed feelings about the Obama administration because domestically, I think his
Yeah,
administration did a lot to try, at least, to improve the lives of average Americans. Uh, I can name a whole bunch of things that I
yeah,
like or don't like, whether it comes to Obamacare or to the Supreme
yeah.
Court
Certainly.
decision,
Yeah,
the things that the Obama
equality.
administration
Yeah,
had tried to push forward that led to the Supreme Court decision to legalize gay marriage throughout the entire land. All that
yep.
is arguable, and there are things that I liked and disliked about what he did. But in the realm of foreign policy, I sincerely think that the Obama administration, and this could either be the president or his staff, I don't know, either or.
Yeah,
According to people I know that are family friends
mm-hmm.
who have that level of access at the higher level in DC. They're like, yeah, the Obama staffers have this ideal world situation they wanted the world to be, and they said they were going to make the drastic moves for those things to happen without regard to the consequences of the actions they were going to take. And so you get things like Libya, you get things like
Yeah,
Syria. I remember I remember a year ago when people like you and our friends, or our mutual former theater friends on Facebook were saying, "Oh, Obama's so great, he ended 2 wars," and I was just getting off the plane from deploying to the Middle East, and I was like, "Bitch, why am I still fighting them?" It's like, really?
Yeah.
It's like he ended the war in Afghanistan. That's not true. We still have troops there advising the Afghans. You can look this up. It's called Operation Freedom Sentinel. That's the operation that replaced OEF, or Operation Enduring Freedom. And then there's the whole Operation Inherent Resolve thing, which basically replaced Operation Iraqi Freedom after the administration pulled us out in 2012.
Yeah.
And then they started up some more adventures in the Middle East, or North Africa, excuse me, with Libya and the deposement of Gaddafi.
That was just poor.
And then now we have the situation in Syria. So
yeah, no, it's true. I definitely was at the time speaking of, like, Obama's ended 2 wars, which, granted, also even that was not accurate. Sorry, I'm not sure if I can still hear you.
You can't hear me?
Oh, no. Okay. Sorry, I thought you went out. Yeah, I mean, like, even that was not entirely true. Like, if you look at what happened in Iraq, it was just Iraq. I mean, the Obama administration at the time, before we pulled out of Iraq, from my understanding anyways, was trying to negotiate with the Iraqi government to have more of a plurality between the different sects. And that sort of wasn't happening. And so the Obama administration was like, well, if you're not going to do that, then we're not going to support you, which was in terms of, like, ending a war, that's much less of ending a war and more like, well, we're not going to support this anymore.
Yeah, it's just sort of just saying, oh, well, we're going to give up now because you guys can't come to an agreement.
Yeah. Yeah. And that one's tough because it's like, do we support a country which is oppressing a minority, or actually majority is oppressing a majority, and which ended up, and like those sect problems within Iraq ended up further fueling ISIS. Like, if there weren't sect problems within the government, I think ISIS might still have ended up being a problem, but this certainly exacerbated and just made it spread so much faster.
Most of the minds in the Department of Defense, from people at my level all the way to people as old as my dad, the general mindset is that the Iraq invasion was most likely was a mistake. If we hadn't gone into Iraq the way we had, the situation now would be a lot different. And you're right, sectarian. So Iraq, for those people who aren't very familiar with Iraq as a country, it sits on the country's borders are literally drawn around a dividing line between 3 major populations of people. You have the Sunni west, you have the Kurdish north, and then you have the Shia south and east.
Yeah.
And those sectarian divides were a major part of the country of Iraq and part of the everyday life of the country. And Saddam Hussein, as horrible as he was, put a lid on all of that sectarian conflict.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's a tough decision. And then when he gets to 2012, by the 2012 time, there's another complicated situation. And if you're interested, there's a whole history about our involvement in Iraq, starting from 2004 until 2012, where a lot of the decisions we were making played into their next door neighbor's hands, Iran.
Yeah.
And if you there's a great article in the Atlantic called "The Shadow Commander." It's about the head of the Iranian Special Forces, General Qasem Soleimani, and basically the elected government of Iraq and the guy that we put up for the prime ministership in Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, he had to be vetted by the Iranians before essentially they allowed him to be prime minister of the country. And this was before Iran physically sent troops to the country a la now
Yeah.
post ISIS, or during the
Yeah.
ISIS conflict. So Iran had a lot of influence in that area because of the Shia population. So there was just this whole history of bad missteps that we made in the Middle East that are continuing to compound right now. There's a great book.
It sounds like a nightmare scenario. That's because it's a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, there's a great book out on the subject by Dexter Filkins. It's called The Forever War. And if you ever decide you want to read something depressing, read that book. It's about how the United States and the West made bad mistakes or bad decisions in the Middle East that drives our policy to continue to make bad decisions. And it's called the Forever War because if we continue along this current trend, there's no end in sight to the amount of bad decisions we make in that area of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is one of the situations where I also wonder how much this actually, I mean, maybe I'll tie it less back to the election, but there are definitely, I've met liberal veterans who were just like absolutely devastated by the military actions our country has been taking recently. And we're just like, this is insane. Like, I will literally do anything, vote for anything but what we're doing now internationally.
Yeah, it seems like the U.S. foreign policy post Iraq War, post 9/11 has been along the tune of hyper interventionalism, and if you and it's not just interventionism, like interventionism in my opinion, at its very most strident was like the Reagan involvement in Grenada. You have an 8-hour conflict that deposes the dictator, and at its very least, intervention involves things like the Bosnia War in '96, where you're supporting a coalition against another government that's committing war crimes. That's what I consider to be standard levels of intervention. Hyper-interventionalism is now when we're going into countries and basically tearing them down and rebuilding them and their government structures from the bottom up.
It's really, yeah.
And
I'll let you finish. Sorry.
And the line that neoliberalists who like this thinking, I don't know, I'm kind of confused whether it's neoliberal or neoconservative or neocon. That supports hyper interventionalism. But if some media outlets and talking heads on the mainstream media say, well, if you're not for this, then you must be a pacifist. Can't there be like somewhere in between? You're not quite a pacifist. You don't believe there's no situation where military forces can be used.
Yeah.
Because I'm in the military. I definitely believe that there are situations where the military must be used, and we have no choice but to do so. But I don't exactly quite believe that we need to continue on the line of hyper-interventionalism where we're going into countries and, messing with their social fabrics and trying to rebuild a country's government from the ground up. That costs a ton of resources and lives and time.
It's not productive. It's actually much more counterproductive, I think, than most people realize. Because not only is it not productive, but then there are a lot of people in Iraq who I imagine have a very particular impression of the U.S. government, and there are a lot of people just who have been on the ground where U.S. soldiers were, and to clarify any patriotic issue, I 100% stand behind U.S. soldiers. It's just U.S. federal policy where they put soldiers that I have problems with. But it's just those federal policies have damaged so many people. That
by federal policy, you mean foreign policy of the United States?
Yeah, it's right? Federal foreign. Yeah, yeah.
Just clarifying.
Yes. So foreign policy is just and we can debate to what extent and whether how justified it is, and there's back and forth. But the reality is we've created these war zones that, in my opinion, were largely, if not entirely, unnecessary. And a lot of people, rightly so or not, are going to look to the US as having created these war zones. And that's more dangerous than if we didn't go in the first place.
When it comes to creating war zones, there's a slight distinction there that I kind of disagree with.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Afghanistan, the initial war in Afghanistan was against Al Qaeda, not necessarily the Taliban government, but we expanded it to involve the Taliban government. And that's not necessarily us creating war zones. The war zone was already there.
That's true.
Before we sort of got involved. What I will agree with is that there are cases where we exacerbate war zones. Like I said, the Syrian conflict being somewhat of an example of that, because the Syrian rebels and the way we chose who to fund and who to support and who to arm, slightly exacerbated it, but it's nothing like what the Russians did in that they moved a large part of their military forces to that country to help that to help that country's regime and their military.
No, and they're just to clarify, like the the Russian government is just flat out intentionally bombing hospitals.
Yeah.
Like as far as I'm aware, the U.S. government it like there are challenges in the way that we conduct war, but I've never seen a situation where the U.S. government intentionally bombs civilian hospitals.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to intentionally creating war zones, like you said, I think the only example where you can point to the U.S. as being at fault would be Iraq in 2004.
Yeah. No, I would agree, and yeah, no,
in the 21st century at least.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, and I have no disagreement there. And I think it also gets back to that other thing too, like we were discussing. There's like the reality of what the U.S. does, and then this like rather annoying thing of how we handle what the U.S. does and the perception that it creates. And it's like one of those tough things where like Afghanistan is like I don't like it, but I support that because like the mastermind behind 9/11 was there. And also, like, there's a very specific geographic terrorist group that has specifically targeted us successfully.
Yeah.
And, like, there's a very concrete target to deal with that was verified. So, but, yeah. So.
Yeah, no.
Yes.
I agree. There's just a lot, and tying it back to the Trump administration, a new Trump administration, there are certain benefits. Surprise, as much as anybody listening might hate the guy, there are certain benefits to a Trump administration and our foreign policy. The perception around the world by just the average person. Like I talked to one of my friends from Japan, and We talked about the election a little bit, and I was like, oh, God, yeah, he's my boss now, commander-in-chief. Oh, God, And she's like, well, at least he probably doesn't – he's probably not going to be so much involved in trying to send you to other countries and intervene in other countries, And I was like, you kind of have a point. He hasn't – during the campaign trail, he didn't really talk about
that's true.
regime change or – trying to put forth, policies to exacerbate the wars we already intervened in. Other than, we're going to bomb the crap out of ISIS and, we're going to bomb terrorists. Also, like, we're going to bomb terrorists and their families. It's like, oh, okay, wow, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and also, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the main thing I'm trying to say is
if we just bomb everyone, then that doesn't solve all the problems.
Yeah, right. But yeah, the main thing the main thing my friend was saying was at least he doesn't seem to have a very interventionist stance, which is a good thing, I think. And his foreign policy, I think he's going to be concentrated more about trade and more about making a deal with countries who do want our armed forces protection, who want to be part of our security umbrella. And I think that'll have. I don't think that'll have if he actually does what he says, which who knows?
Debatable.
But
we'll see.
If he actually does do what he says he'll do, it's going to provide a couple of benefits. One, it's going to take a load off of the armed forces currently as they are manned, because the Obama administration cut a large number of our manning, and then it got us involved in 2 more Middle Eastern wars. So it was this message of you're going to do more with less, and that's partially part of the reason why a lot of military folks vote Republican, is because they increase our manning and our budget. But I digress. The whole attitude of doing more with less is not
productive.
Not productive. And under a Trump administration, there are doubts that he will continue the trend, which is a good thing overall. And second of all, if we're now having a mindset of, okay, well, if we're going to provide protection for you, country A, B, or C, you have to show us a clear benefit you can provide us for doing so. In the 20th century, we did a lot of messed up things in the 20th century, but you cannot deny that the United States was probably the most generous country in terms of amount of stuff that we just gave other countries carte blanche because we didn't want to see them fall to communism.
Yeah, and that's for a whole variety of reasons. It's like I don't want the United States to just like withdraw all of its troops completely to like the United. We're only going to have people in the United States. Like, no, if there are countries that want our troops in their country for self-defense and are willing to work for it, then I think there is a place to negotiate there.
Wow, but, you mean you're not an isolationist? You don't support hyper-interventionism, but you're not an isolationist? What is this world?
Whoa. Yeah, it's just this thing about World War II and
oh man, that would be a topic for a whole another podcast. World War II and World War I especially, and its effects on the world. But
no, but it's just like I mean, my family was we escaped from, this is like a little personal background digression, but my ancestors escaped from sort of Russia, Poland, across Europe. We're lucky to make it to the United States, and I say lucky as in they several times escaped deadly situations that were directed specifically at them.
This is in the 1930s.
This was the Russian Poland side of my family was actually in more like, I think, around the time of World War One.
Okay, so the pogroms then.
The pogroms, yeah. I mean, like my grandfather just pretended that he was dead with the rest of his village, and then went and found his family.
Holy crap, that's crazy.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just actually explain. Pogroms were, I believe, in Russia there's a group called, I think it's much more cultural now, I'm not sure, but at the time there are these groups called Cossacks, which I believe were more of a cultural group that were sort of egged on by the transitioning government. And the short story is they would go around to, I know specifically Jewish villages and I think other minority villages, and they would just like, at the very least, shoot up all of the adult men in the village, and probably worse things. Anyway, so that's what was going on. But I look at that, and then also the Holocaust, and like there's a fine balance. And like you were speaking to about like defending other countries, like there's sovereignty, and I mean that's one of the things I struggle with like when it comes to genocide, because like there was some of that happening going on.
The two of us come from a religious background that had to deal personally with that. So yeah, and I mean, if you like, I don't really necessarily acknowledge it on a regular basis, because like I'm not going to temple to acknowledge the Holocaust. I'm going if I'm going to temple, I'm going to pray. Yeah, it's a very small part.
It's a very small part of it. But at the same time, if I go to temple and I ask anyone there about their relation to the Holocaust, if they didn't specifically have a direct relative that was involved with the Holocaust, then they know someone who had a direct relative that was involved with the Holocaust.
Yeah, and that situation is still within living memory.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that yeah.
No, it is.
So now we have this dilemma of whether or not we think it's okay to deploy troops for those reasons, to prevent genocide or provide humanitarian, but at the same time, if we're anti-interventionist or hyper-interventionist, then what do we do with that seeming contradiction? And that's a thought that I think the both of us will probably have to wrestle with later. I think currently,
no, I'm sitting here, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think currently here, in my mind, every case has to go by a case-by-case basis, whether or not we choose to intervene, depending on the situation, the cost benefits to it, not just purely cost benefit analysis either, because as a nation we have a history of doing things that don't necessarily benefit us the most, but just because we think that it's morally right to intervene, and that's a trait of our country we don't necessarily want to give up either. But no, you're right. The counterpoint is, if there are places in the world that we go to because we think we can help them, but they don't actually need our help or don't want our help, then why should we be going there?
Yeah.
I had a friend in my last unit who said that they went to study abroad in West Africa, and it was kind of a study abroad / volunteer to help the poor kids kind of stuff, and and she voiced her concerns one day to I guess one of the program managers about like, okay, we're helping. It doesn't seem like we're helping these people because we are housed in these first world, almost sort of hotel-like apartments in the city as we go to school, and then we go to these poor regions to help the kids, but we don't actually do anything to change the situation that they're in. Even if they don't, whether or not they don't want us to, because I mean, I'm pretty sure there are people out there who just want life to go on as it is, live in a village that way in those kind of conditions. It's not anything related to first world standards of living at all, but it's what they want. So,
just because you live in a third world situation doesn't mean your life is shit.
It's like you don't have plasma screen TVs, but I mean, if life is simple and you're happy and you're alive, and it doesn't seem like there are,
or like maybe you don't have a plasma screen TV, but like your bar has a TV and you hang out with all your friends at a bar and watch TV,
or something like that too. I mean, and these people, I'm not entirely sure about the situation that my friend was in, but this was these people might have, like, I don't think these people were exactly wanting for food, like they were starving or something. They could have been. I don't remember the situation that well, but the main point of me discussing the situation in the first place is when she voiced her concern to a program manager or something. This program manager is like, oh, well, why do you think we're not doing so good? It's like, are you uncomfortable with like interacting with the Africans or something? Like you don't like them because they're. It's like, no, it's not because I'm racist. It's because I think we're not exactly doing things that are helping them. I don't think they want our help.
Yeah.
So there's always that issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like I've been to Ghana and Uganda. I've studied I took several classes in human rights and discussed this with professors while I was in those countries, and it's a tough thing. Like I don't know, you're at home and like someone has a better way of life and they come in and tell you how to do your life. It's like,
that's not acceptable by any.
And that's whether that's the intent of these aid organizations. A lot of times that's exactly what happens.
And it's not acceptable by any libertarian worldview at all to come in and say this is how you ought to live.
Yeah, no, and it's like, if anything, I mean, like, this is me having gone to a business school, but it's like, if anything, like, you support it through economic development, not in the way that you think the economy should be developed, but in the way that the economy is developing.
Yeah, it has to be grown. It has to be grown organically, or it won't make much
Yeah,
sense to the
yeah,
local
and there are
population.
ways to support that without like even with the Dakota Access thing, like I wasn't at first, but now I'm very intentional when even when I share a criticism, like, and I'm not necessarily blessed, but I have access to indirectly, very indirectly, to chief elders in that area. So before I share things, a lot of times I'll go and ask people who are in that area, like, I know it's not directly asking the tribal elders, but I want it as much as I possibly can without being able to talk to the tribal elders to be in the respectful way that the tribal elders are asking for.
Yeah,
Because both in that situation and in a development situation and in an economic situation, like even economically, like you go in and tell someone this product's amazing and it's going to change your life, and if people don't feel like the product's amazing and it's going to change their life, then your product sucks regardless of how cool it is.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um,
It has to be a natural progression of things.
yeah,
And I think that's a good segue to our third topic, which is going to be about this Canadian psychology professor,
yeah,
Jordan Peterson. And again, talking about the freedom to organically advance one's society and how elements of the authoritarian left seem to be trying to impose a certain type of language or a certain type of, I guess, ideological thinking upon a society before it's ready to accept it. I think is a good segue into the
yeah,
Jordan Peterson issue.
yeah, for sure.
So this is a topic that neither of us have a better amount of expertise over the other
Yeah,
on intention, because this will probably provoke a
yeah,
better discussion than other topics. So let me go ahead and just start what my understanding of the situation is, and then
yeah,
we'll
for
go into
sure.
what you understand. My understanding of the situation is that this Canadian professor at the University of Toronto was under fire because he
Yeah.
refused to use certain gender pronouns, and and he refused to use certain gender pronouns because they were going to be codified in a bill called C-16 in the Canadian
Yeah.
Criminal Code. And so his concern there.
Oh, so I didn't realize this. He was specifically refusing to use them because they were going to be sort of legally enacted language in this bill.
Exactly. That was his
Okay, I
point of
didn't
view. What
realize
did
that.
you understand?
Um, I just thought he was refusing to use people's preferred gender pronouns just because,
Oh,
which seems
that is,
at
yeah.
least a little bit less like an asshole now, but
Yeah.
still, I mean, yeah. So yeah, you can continue explaining.
Okay, so yeah, so Bill C-16 was going to codify transgender pronouns as part of the Canadian Criminal Code of of basically law. I don't want to say law mandated language, but it's language that is now codified in law to be used. And
Yeah.
his major contention with that is that it's a free speech issue, and people,
Mhm.
like, it shouldn't be the language that people use shouldn't be policed by the law, especially when it's used in a way to compel people to use certain speech, including certain transgender pronouns. And
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson has gotten um, a couple of warning letters from his university, among other things,
Mm,
and he faces the potential loss of his job over this because of an issue he refuses to back down on. And
yeah.
I think that he makes a very good point, because if you start to do this with language, and it becomes a hate crime to.
You just end up in 1984.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
it becomes a hate crime to not address somebody by a pronoun that's codified in law. Then it starts to
it
traverse over the line of free speech.
it can snowball so fast.
Absolutely, because
Yeah.
yeah, because one situation will lead to this precedence will lead to another precedence, and to be honest, from Peterson's side, he has received letters from many people in the transgender community who support him because these particular pronouns are gender neutral pronouns that he's being
Yeah.
compelled to use, and a lot of transgender people, if I understand correctly, they go through enormous amounts of effort to become the other sex, right? So
Yep.
you
Yeah.
they want to be addressed by the pronouns of the opposite sex as opposed to the
Yeah.
sex that they were biologically born in. So
Yeah.
yeah, so what so I guess we cleared up a little bit of a misunderstanding that you had with the Peterson issue.
Yeah, more so just I think in terms of like my perception of him, not so much in terms. Yeah, I mean, I have I'll just like say I have a lot of friends who are gender queer, I guess I would say. That's a term that I feel pretty comfortable using, largely just because that's what they've told me is a term that they identify with. Um, which doesn't necessarily it can, but doesn't necessarily indicate that they're switching away from their gender. It's just like sometimes it just means like for me, if I use genderqueer, it just means like why do you always have to think about every single thing I do as masculine?
Mm-hmm.
um, and but yeah, I mean, in terms of freedom of speech, I think it's very like yeah. Do I think it's hateful to say certain things? Absolutely. Like
But referring
it's
to somebody by an incorrect pronoun isn't
well,
necessarily
yeah.
hateful.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things where I don't think it's intended as hateful.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and
Um,
intent is a huge part
yeah,
when you're determining.
that's true. Hate speech.
Yeah, when you're determining hate speech is
Yeah,
intent because again
that's
military
true.
military background like I got friends and we go at it back in my old unit. We used to go at it. It's like, oh yeah, this guy he's a yeah you know just
Yeah.
banter that crosses over into unprofessional language. You know what I mean? Like it's like, oh yeah, this guy steal my money, what a Jew, and like it just sort of rolls off my back because I can give it back to them. You be like, oh yeah, well,
Yeah.
I steal your money, you better go steal a soul, redhead, like that kind of thing. Or
Yeah.
bad joke, but anyway, like
I mean, they're
that
both
kind
bad
of
jokes.
yeah
That's the point of the example.
yeah that kind of banter back and forth is sort of like normal within military circles because the intent behind the speech isn't true hatred.
Yeah.
My mate who joked like that toward me, he doesn't hate Jews. He doesn't hate me because I'm Jewish. He was making a joke at the expense of my religious background, and me in turn, in retaliation, made fun of the fact that he's a ginger, and rightly so because he's a fucking ginger. But intent is big when determining
Yeah, I
the difference
think
between
for
hate speech.
legality purposes, it's a huge thing because there's a huge difference between someone saying, I hate Jews, and someone saying, I'm going to kill Jews. And the thing is, like, even when you say you're going to kill someone because of who they are, there even then there's like a line which this is
Yeah.
gray, and I'm not sure how much I want to get into it, but it's like can you like is that the only thing that they're doing, or can you point to other incidences in language where they like there's actually a development
Yeah.
um and or like actual actions of like oh like I started talking about killing Jews 2 months ago, and I also have continuously bought like guns in the past 2 months and been creating plans to kill Jews like
And then even then, in the legal context, until that person actually does something violent, then none of everything the
um
person says then doesn't matter.
yeah, I think there is an area. What I mean, there is. I don't know the details behind this, but there is an area before violence happens where you can legally step in.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean that's also like deviating this like way far beyond gender and the intent I think of this discussion, which is just like freedom of speech. Like someone can call me a pussy. Like, I'm going to defend their freedom of speech for that.
Yeah,
And
but it's yeah.
but like I find that like
It's very
depending on
boorish.
who I'm talking to and like how well they might understand
Yeah,
like
if they know you
gender
or yeah.
relations, that yeah, then I might find it more acceptable because I know their stances on things. Um, but regardless of how hateful or not I find it from who it's coming from, they have like we live in the United States. If we start mandating what people can and can't say, it just gets so dangerous. And also, like, I think, I like the thing I always go back to, like, from a liberal perspective, like, yeah, maybe I support it a tiny bit more, but what if it's flipped?
Mm-hmm.
What if it's flipped and someone says, like, I can't say something anti-Christian
Yeah.
just because I don't like Christianity, which is like that's a not the case. I just have problems with the way certain people treat religion sometimes.
Yes. Yes.
Um, but and so it's like that, and the Supreme Court also like I've done mock Supreme Court trials sort of around this, and they are very careful about this because they just, regardless of the generations, they as a whole anyways, not necessarily individual justices, are very careful to tell citizens what they cannot say.
Yes. That's a very good point. And
um,
and again, like
Granted
going
different countries, but
right, different countries, but they both of our democratic traditions come from
yeah,
pretty similar
similar.
civil codes, civil laws,
Yeah,
and yeah, you're absolutely right. Is like especially when it comes to speech deriding religion. Like if you want to say, well, you can't criticize, for example, Islam, then
yeah,
you have just ceded your right to criticize Christianity or any other religion or
yeah,
Judaism even.
yeah,
Basically, I think we agree on this. The principle that restricting free speech. If you say that you need to ban certain speech because of its discriminatory tone toward one group, you have ceded your free speech to criticize any other group
yeah,
at all.
yeah, and yeah, I think there's a huge difference between wanting to yell at someone and putting them in jail because
Yeah,
they said something that offends you
yeah.
and maybe even makes you feel unsafe.
Or
Uh,
or or even the loss of their livelihood too, like getting somebody
yeah,
fired because they said something you don't like.
yeah, yeah. I've had some interesting situations with that. Someone,
Yeah, please enumerate.
yeah, someone I know who, as far as I think he doesn't necessarily identify as liberal, but he definitely is pretty aware of, I think, like liberal ideas. Anyway, he basically there was this public discussion on his Facebook page where basically he talked about immigrating from a certain country. He's Caucasian, and how his family basically worked their way up through the American system, and anyone who's in the US who's bitching that the American system doesn't work for them is just being ridiculous. And um, he was basically saying, I think he actually did say, like, I'm quoting him. I think he said, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is a joke
Mm-hmm.
and it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And there were like that particular statement was like frustrating for me, but then there were follow-up statements that he made to someone else who was black who was discussing their personal experience, and he was basically saying um like this guy was saying like sometimes he's uncomfortable sitting on his front porch because the neighborhood where he lives in, the police, just like he feels less comfortable with the police.
Yeah.
And this other guy was saying, well, like, I forget exactly what he said, but he was basically like saying your life challenges are a bunch of bullshit. Like stop making this up. And someone started saving everything he said, copying and pasting it, and sending it to his employer.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Wow.
and yeah, which is like, I'm still not sure how I feel about that. Like, just on the basis, I'm going to say I don't support that. But at the same time, you're in a public space and you're talking, and you can't, like, if I go outside and I say something, like, I'm going to say it with the knowledge that people are hearing me.
Right.
Um, and so it's like I don't.
Free speech comes with the responsibility.
Free speech comes with a responsibility, and I go back and forth. Like, legality of free speech, I'm not going to argue with too much,
Right.
because like, but your job with free speech, like, I don't know. Sometimes like your employer has the right to, like, most employees are fire at will, and
Yeah, if
they're
it's a private organization.
yeah, if
Sure.
it's a private organization, yeah, absolutely.
And it looks like that the employees' public statements are going to reflect badly on the business, then yeah, it's the business's right to fire that
Yeah,
employee.
well, not only that, actually, if it's going to reflect badly on the company's profits, and it's actually their legal obligation to fire the employee.
Yeah.
So, but I go back and forth about that, and I've had follow-up conversations with that individual where I think basically he was getting pretty pissed off that his opinions weren't getting respected.
Yeah.
And I was just like, you've got to be shitting me. Like, you're pissed off your opinions aren't getting respected while you're telling people that their life experiences are bullshit.
Yeah. So, I mean, sure. From what you've told me, the guy, this person,
Yeah.
Cognitive dissonance. I don't think he understands that he's doing the exact same thing to others that he claims is being done to him. And this person, this person does not know how to express himself with tact, and that's not a
Yeah.
I don't think that that's a fireable offense, because after all, it is his
Yeah,
free
no,
speech.
I agree.
I mean, I'm assuming this guy didn't use racial slurs when he was talking to this person, right? Or or using language that clearly showed him that he didn't think he was human, or he didn't like him because of his skin color. I think he was just saying that your opinions are invalid, and I am not going to acknowledge your personal experiences as a valid, point of discussion. So that's different. That's not discrimination. That's just a guy being an asshole.
Yeah, and I agree.
And being an asshole is still you're still free to do that in this country.
Yeah,
in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm in Korea. I am not in the United States, but in the United States.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are the U.S. actually the total offshoot? Are the U.S. military bases there considered like U.S. ground or Korean ground?
U.S. ground. Like my sister was born in a U.S. air base in the Philippines, and she was born a U.S. citizen. So yeah, military bases are considered U.S. ground. However, legal jurisdiction depends on the severity of the crime committed and where. So if it's off base, I think usually the Korean authorities have jurisdiction. But yeah. But anyway, yeah. Back to this, the Jordan Peterson issue, I think underlines that. So Bill C-16 proposed to outlaw harassment and discrimination based on gender identity and gender expression under the Human Rights Act and Criminal Code of Canada. However, his objection, he doesn't concern himself with the LGBT discrimination legal debate, but rather freedom of speech regarding the accommodation language.
Yeah, and I do have to head out in a second. I haven't read the specifics of that, but yeah, I mean, if what I'm understanding is correct, then I think I agree with that. It's like, as far as I understand, he was not arguing about the discrimination part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he was just purely arguing about the freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, it's sucky.
His detractors are comparing his lack of using gender binary pronouns for transgender people as equivalent to a human rights violation. They're saying, I've seen these videos where people are telling him, well, this is about our livelihood, and people are being killed, and people are being assaulted for being who they are, and your stance of not wanting to use these gender binary pronouns is just as bad. And that sort of boggles my mind, because that's quite a leap in logic of not wanting to use particular gender pronouns and equating it to to violence.
Yeah, and I think there's this tough thing which the liberal left needs to come to terms with, that if you're not okay with someone saying things that are offensive to you, like they trigger you, even in a way that could make you emotionally unsafe. And I do mean this seriously. That's not on the other person. And I don't mean that to at all invalidate the needs of those people, but
The other person just doesn't know, and so you can't.
the other
fault
person doesn't know. You can't. I mean, if we're gonna go that route, then you go down a route of like, okay, what language can you illegalize to prevent suicides? And it's just like I personally don't think that's a safe route to go down. There are
No.
a lot of things where I would like to support, but I don't want to end up in a 1984 situation
where certain language is restricted.
Yeah,
because you go down a slippery slope.
I think that there are very clear legal situations where you can defend people's human rights, and those should be taken.
Yeah.
And I think our argument should be in that space anyways, because it's not being addressed. In the United States and Canada, there are a lot of gaps across our country where people's rights to be who they are, where that is not harming anyone else, is physically not being granted. And
however,
denying denying someone else's freedom of speech does not solve that problem.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, like, I know a lot of people don't like Macklemore for various reasons, but like, I really enjoy his lyrics about how legalizing gay marriage is not going to solve our problems, but it's a good place to start. And I think that legalizing people's rights to physically address their needs is a good place to start. Illegalizing someone's freedom of speech first of all, doesn't address those real problems. And second of all, just is like a dangerous path.
Yeah, I could not have said that better myself. I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Well, that's we're now approaching the 2-hour mark, and I think that's a really good discussion we've had so far. So we definitely have some topics to talk about for the next podcast, whenever that will be.
Yeah.
And I think this was a productive first time for doing this, and I'm glad you could join me here. Raffi.
On the other side of the planet.
Yeah, I'm glad we could accomplish this, and you have a safe journey back home after Thanksgiving. You have an enjoyable Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too. I think you're past Thanksgiving at this point, but I hope
that was
I hope you have it that you're still on break right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So have a fun Thanksgiving weekend. That's dangerous. I don't know how dangerous it's allowed to be, but yeah. Well, I hope you had fun this weekend.
All right. Thanks, man.
All right. Peace, dude.